Well, good afternoon. My name's Dominic Steele and welcome along to the Pastor's Heart this afternoon. It's great to have you with us. The aim of the Pastor's Heart, we're aiming to serve senior pastors around the place. Of course, assistant ministers, anybody on the ministry staff really, and even everyday regular Christians, but particularly our focus is on senior pastors. And so today, I'm really excited. We're going to be speaking in a second to Simon Manchester. And Simon's been at St Thomas's in North Sydney for 27 years, so he's been responsible for Easter there for 27 years. We're going to be asking him about how to preach Easter well. I was thinking myself, as I come to Easter this year, who would I like to learn from? And I thought it was Simon Manchester. And so I'm thrilled to have him along. Now, you can ask a question. You can go to the Facebook page and you can, on that page, ask a question or make a comment, and we'll be able to interact with that as well. So, Simon Manchester, welcome along to the Pastor's Heart.
Thank you, Dominic. Great to be with you.
It's great to have you with us. Now, we're going to get to the business of Easter in a moment, but at the start of these different programs, I've been asking people about their heart and a journey that God has led them on. And I just thought, with you here, the other day I rang up a senior minister that I knew was struggling and having a really difficult time, and I rang him up and reached out to him because really you'd modelled that to me in ringing me up and reaching out to me when I was in difficulty back in 2010. And I remember you taking me out for lunch on my first day of stress leave, and how extraordinarily helpful you were. But one of the things you did was you gave me a CD, and I don't know if you'll remember this, of biographical talks by John Piper on various Christian leaders. Why did you do that?
I think I'd been so helped by the talks, and I was conscious that John Piper, in giving these biographical talks, was very acquainted, not just with the story, but also the struggle that so many of these leaders had been through. And I actually used to walk at night, going for my evening stroll, listening to these talks, thinking to myself, here is a guy across the ocean who understands exactly what's going on in a pastor's head. Because the way he taught and the way he personalised so much of what he did, I thought, this is a pastor's friend. So if it was a help to you as well, I'm very glad.
It was a massive help to me, and I remember listening every day of the stress leave. I think I went through one talk a day, one biographical talk a day. I remember you saying to me, actually, I don't follow Piper for exegesis, I follow him for biography. But you wouldn't notice this if you were just listening to one of his talks, one of his biographical talks. But when you listen to them one after the other, after the other, after the other, you notice that the area of the pastor's life that he's examining, the pastor from the past, is their walk in suffering.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, he made sure that he didn't just tell the story, but he actually looked at a particular angle. And again, the angle was, how did John Newton balance being tough and tender? Or how did Simeon persevere when everybody was against him? Or how did Wilberforce keep going? These were the sort of the real battles.
How's God led you through some of these valleys?
Well, I've had a few valleys. I've had a physical valley of needing bypass surgery in my 30s, which was quite a tough time, wife and small children, and that was very scary and instructive. In our marriage, I think we've had some valleys, and the Lord has brought us through and often onto much higher and better ground. And pastorally, I think you can't be in ministry working with other people and not have struggles and trials, and that's been difficult as well. How has he brought me through those things? Kindly, steadily, and surely.
We've got a couple of questions already from on Facebook on our comments feed, but before I get to some of them, Let me just start with you and on the whole subject of preaching Easter. Before we get to the sermon, what are you looking for in the Easter meeting as a whole on Good Friday and Easter Sunday?
I think where we are at North Sydney, we are conscious that quite a lot of our people are away.
Mm-hmm.
There are quite a lot of visitors present. So it isn't a particularly ordinary Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not preparing for the regular and I'm not preparing for the visitor. I think I'm trying to keep the two of them in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So the sermon has got to have help to saving faith and growing faith.
Mm-hmm.
That's the principle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything particular about, just before I get to the sermon, the meeting as a whole on Good Friday morning, you'd want people to bear? For us, for example, we try to get the story, or a testimony maybe, of somebody who came along to church at Easter the first time a year before or 2 years before, and then how they connected back to God and into church and that kind of thing. Try to model a path that somebody else might take.
That is an excellent idea. I knew I would learn good things if I came to sit at your feet. We must be more inventive. I think I'm just thinking of familiar hymns,
Right.
because we don't really want to isolate the visitor,
Mm-hmm.
and many of them do know, as in Christmas, a few Easter hymns. So we would think hymns for the outsider and message for insider and outsider. The rest, I think, is pretty simple. We don't have communion at Easter because we look on it as largely for the visitor.
Yep.
Or at least we're conscious of the visitor. Simple readings, prayers that are sensitive. Yeah, we're trying to keep the insider and the outsider alert and drawn. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, take me to the sermon now. You're doing Good Friday and Easter Sunday in 3-4 weeks' time?
I am, yeah. Unusually I am.
Yeah.
Normally I would do just one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But
And so what are you thinking about as you come to the sermon?
well, when it comes to Good Friday, I think first of all we've got to try and get under the skin of the people who've come, who are expecting something to be said that's quite sentimental. God loves you. So I remember my old boss Dick Lucas was preaching in Japan, and the translator came and said to him, "What's your talk about?" expecting him to say God loves you. And Dick famously said, Good Friday, the message of Good Friday is that given half a chance, the human race will do away with its maker. And he said the translator sat up at that point as if to say, well, now you're talking, you've actually got me interested. So I think we need to get under the skin.
Yeah.
And sometimes we need to be saying to the visitor, the cross, is all over the place. It's on our church and it's on our graves and it's on our Bibles and it hangs around people's neck. But most of the people of this city haven't a clue why. They think they know, but they don't know. And the proof of that is that if you ask them, what does the cross mean to you? They'll come up with something emotional or sentimental. It won't have to do with forgiveness, salvation, assurance. So whatever we do on Good Friday, it's got to be tackling the massive ignorance that people have in a way that draws them.
We've got a question from Liam Denny, and I'll just get that put up on the screen. Liam is asking, what makes a good Easter sermon? What makes a bad Easter sermon? I guess you're starting to answer that one. Anything more you want to throw in?
Well, again, I think, Good Friday is a particular issue. Easter Day is another central issue. What makes a good Easter sermon? It's persuading people who've come that the resurrection is crucial for them. And a bad Easter sermon is leaving them unmoved, unpersuaded, unaffected, disinterested. So how are we going to do that? I don't have the answers for this year. I've still got my preparation to do.
What passages have you chosen?
I haven't chosen. So
Well, help us as you think through how you might choose a passage.
well, I might choose an Old Testament passage.
Right.
It occurs to me to.
I mean, the default is to go to those just the narratives in the Gospels.
Yeah.
But you sound like that's not what you've done every year at all.
No, because there are so many interesting parts of the Old Testament to take at Good Friday and Easter, and there are so many good passages, even in the Psalms, to take for Good Friday and Easter. So I'm going to go away with my Bible for a few hours and think about what to do.
Mm-hmm. So you haven't decided for this year, but okay, you give us some of the places you might be looking. Narrow it down for me a bit. I mean, and you're probably thinking back about what you've done in the past as you answer this.
Well, there are some great and famous passages which, when you've been in the place for 27, 28 years, you've done over and over again. So, I mean, one of the great passages, of course, is Mark 15, where you've got the cry and the curtain. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the great ways of explaining Christianity, because where you've got the cry and the judgment of God coming on Jesus, the Father is saying to the Son, get out. And as the curtain splits, the Father is saying to the world, come in. So this principle of get out, come in, is a very sharp blade explaining what's going on. When you see a cross, you've got to remember he had to get out and you are able to come in. So that's, one of those special and simple passages. But
come on, keep going. That's great. You're on a roll. So.
I mean, inside the epistles, you've got on the cross, you've got a passage like 1 Corinthians 1. Why is the preacher so ordinary? Why is the congregation so ordinary? Why is the message so ordinary? Mm-hmm. Because God is going to do extraordinary things through an ordinary preacher, congregation, and message.
I like that. I mean, at the moment, I have the back half of 1 Corinthians 1 penciled in as my sermon for Good Friday. Great. So keep workshopping and give me some more hints. I like that.
I've run out of ideas completely. I'm going to wait till you finish preaching on it. I mean, 2 Corinthians 5 is another passage where you've got resurrection.
So for Easter Sunday.
Easter Sunday,
yeah. I like the idea in 2 Corinthians 5 in those first 10 verses of thinking, I'm not in heaven now. I mean, I'm camping now, longing to be home with my Father.
Yeah. It's a great passage, yeah. And the other thing I've noticed is that whenever there is a good explanation of the resurrection, there is often a call to mission or to get your values right straight afterwards. Mm-hmm. So 1 Corinthians 15, you've got 57 verses on the resurrection, and then you've got, therefore, beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable. Or in 2 Corinthians, you've got all those early verses on the resurrection, moving from tent to building. And then the second half is basically the work of reconciliation. Mm-hmm. The same in John. You've got John 20, Thomas, my Lord and my God, these are written that you may believe. And then in 21, you've got the fishing and the feed the sheep, so that if you understand the next world, you'll radically rethink this world. Mm-hmm. But if you're committed to this world, you probably don't understand the next world. So test yourself. Believer, unbeliever. If everything applies to this world, you probably don't believe the next world.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Old Testament passages. Because you sound like you're going to be drawn there this year. What are some of the options?
In terms of something new and different, I am drawn to the Old Testament. And it'd be tempting to preach through Isaiah 53 in a way that people understood it, because there is a logical argument through that chapter, whereas most people just remember, we're like sheep have gone astray, the Lord has laid on us the iniquity, laid on him the iniquity of us all. But what is that whole chapter saying, and who can get their head around it? Is there an argument? Mm-hmm. That's one way to go. Some of the Psalms.
Have you done that one before?
I've done it, but not at Good Friday.
Right. And we had Con Campbell do it on Good Friday here, 9 years ago or something, and I thought it worked really well.
Psalms, we've just preached our way through Psalm 23, so I won't do that again, verse by verse, for 5 or 6 weeks. Psalm 16 is a great psalm about treasures at God's right hand. There are lots of good texts in the Old Testament for Easter.
What about Easter Sunday Old Testament texts?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think some of the Psalms are helpful, and a section like Daniel 12 could be helpful.
Really? You'd go there? Yeah.
Or even to take a jewel like Job 19:25. I know that my Redeemer lives. It's sung in the Messiah. What does it mean for the unbeliever? What does it mean for the believer? So I'm looking for an adventure, and the Bible is full of adventure.
Adventures.
Yeah.
How do you, once you've picked your passage, I mean, what are the differences between teaching the occasional talk like Easter and the in-series talk? How do you, first in your preparation, then we'll think about the delivery issues.
Well, the one-off Good Friday, Easter Day is the one talk that a number of visitors are going to hear. That's all they'll get. So are you trying to put some bait on the hook so that they will come and investigate? Or are you trying to give them enough information to go away forever? I mean, that's one of the issues that I think...
Yeah, so, I mean, I talk about it in terms of, is it a first date or are we trying to close the deal? Do you know?
Yeah.
And you actually can't do the first date talk and the close the deal talk. It's difficult to do both those talks at the same time.
Yeah.
What do you go for?
I probably would try to put enough in to close the deal. I mean, that might be naive, but I'm hoping that a person will go away saying, I know the need and I know the news. And if those two wires come together, then there's provision for a response. Is it impossible? It's possible, isn't it, for a person to hear their need and hear the news and make a response. So I would probably be leaning in that direction. I think one of the important things, Dominic, is not to be bored by Good Friday and Easter.
No.
I mean, once you're bored by Good Friday and Easter, you might as well be bored by outer space or by the ocean. You know, the problem is you. It's not the information. There's enough in space and enough in the ocean, and enough in the Bible to thrill. And so dig in, go for it.
So, preparation. Do you find that you kind of know where you want to go before you've done too much thinking and too much hard work in the commentaries? Or do you find in terms of the occasional address, or do you still end up doing the hard work in the commentaries?
Oh, very much the hard work in the commentaries, I think, because you don't want to go to a text and think, I'm going to bend this text in the direction of my interest.
Yeah.
You might take a text and think this would be great and discover that it's actually
Not
bending
great.
in another direction. Or, yeah, maybe it isn't ideal. I mean, last Christmas I took Luke 4, where Jesus was in the temple. And I basically showed...
Christmas?
Yeah. I basically showed how he read his job description in Luke 4 and then stopped before the judgment bit. And I said to the congregation, you know, if you're a visitor, this is why Christianity looks so feeble. Because at the moment it's an offer. But in the future it's going to be a judgment. So don't despise the Christian faith because it's an offer. It's a very gracious offer. Round the corner is a judgment. And the only reason he's not talking judgment is because that's round the corner. So, yeah, so I mean, you can take a very different passage for a very different occasion.
And that's obviously influenced the way you've preached it by the fact that it is an occasional address.
Yeah. And the aim of that is that a person might come in and say, gee, I was expecting to get the shepherds and, lo, there were shepherds out in the fields. And I was told something completely different, which got under my skin. And that, I think, is a big part of what we're trying to do.
I've seen Christmas and Easter, and something in Good Friday and Easter Sunday. In the first place, I'm trying to scoop them into one of our evangelistic courses. And so just on that bait and, first date or close the deal.
Yeah.
And so I say, now you might say this is a serious thing, I want to explore more, do the Introducing God course. And so I then close the deal with filling in the card. And I said, but actually some of you might think, oh yeah, I'll do that course, but actually I want to fix it with God today, and then offer the prayer. But so I do the come to the course as if you like the main offer, and then the prayer for those. But I haven't done it as a kind of push people to pray. I've done it as a if you'd like to pray, then here's the invitation.
Yeah, I think that's ideal. I mean, to some people who are there present, you're able to say to them, if you're at the position now where you know it's time, this is what you could say. If you're not at that position, this is the next step to go, exactly what you're saying. And I think every time we preach at Good Friday or Easter, we're conscious that there is a complete range of people present. Even some of our congregation have never made that step.
Yeah. And in fact, that's definitely the case in our situation. We've had people who've come to church. They might have even been through an Introducing God course or something like that. But it was actually the moment of Good Friday where the atonement was put clearly, that they actually closed with the Lord Jesus.
Yeah. Was it Wesley's mother who was converted or given assurance getting the cup at the communion?
Really?
Yeah. Apparently somebody gave it to her and said, drink this in remembrance that Christ died for you.
And be thankful.
Penny dropped.
Yeah. Well, certainly I remember, actually it was at the Easter convention at Katoomba. I'd taken along a non-Christian friend. He just started to come to church, and he was an alcoholic. And they passed around the wine, and he was at the moment of, will I take this or not? And then he thought, well, if I fall off the wagon here, then God's not real. And if he looks after me, then I'm going to step out in faith. Now, I'm not saying that every alcoholic should do that, but that was his decision in the moment, and it was the communion service at Easter Convention that really he grasped hold of the gospel.
Yeah, that's very wonderful.
So you then come to the presentation. What would you do extra to accommodate the visitor in the presentation that you may not do in your regular, when it's a particular visitor day? Yeah.
I don't think that I would do things very differently, I have to say, because a lot of what I do on Sundays I know is going to go a little more widely. And so I'm always thinking of a wider group. I mean, our talks, they get recorded, somebody listens in Timbuktu.
On the radio,
Yeah. So it's not very different. But I do, as my old boss used to say, want to get them on the train. He talked, Dick Lucas used to talk about the foolishness of bringing your sermon like a train to the station, tooting the horn, and then racing off with nobody in the carriages. So you've got to get your people on board with you for a particular issue. And I think that's part of what we're raising before we come to our passage. What is the issue the passage is raising? And we get people to come with us and travel with us. And I'm also thinking, as I normally do, about how to illustrate at certain points, because I know concentration spans are short and I want to keep people with me. And it needs to be simple but profound. I've often said I'm working for the professor and the plumber.
So John Chapman, I remember, he used to want us to get to the text a minute after we'd started speaking. What's your kind of thinking on that kind of thing?
I do tend to begin by saying we're looking at John 6, and we're looking at John 6 for this reason, and then a couple of hooks to get them interested. Speaking of John Chapman, John told a great Good Friday illustration. He said, as you may have heard him say, he would say to a congregation, under what circumstances would you give your child away? And then, of course, people think, no circumstance. Then he said, under what circumstance would you give your child away to killers? Obviously, no circumstance. And then he'd say, you would do anything to prevent your child from being harmed. Now he said, if God is the perfect father and gives his son to killers, to kill him, there's got to be a good reason for it. And that, I think, is a great way of getting people to say, there must be something in this death of Jesus. It's got to be more serious, because you don't give your child away to killers unless there's a serious issue. So I think John was a good example of being able to introduce an issue before you'd then get to the passage to answer it.
A couple of questions from Facebook for us. We've got one from Sylvanus Theme, and he's asked here, how do you best encourage guests in particular to actively investigate Jesus?
We often invite people to something now called Christianity Condensed, which is just a 1-hour session. And we say this is all it is. It's the complete overview in 1 hour. And it's the bait on the hook, because at the end of that, I will say you can stop and go home and we'll wave goodbye, or you can keep coming and learn a lot more. So that's one of the things we do. We'll say Christianity Condensed follows the weekend. This is the night, come and join us. But otherwise we do normal things like everybody else. We give out copies of the gospel, we give out little booklets, we direct them to websites, all those sorts of things.
And another one we've got in from Ernie Burgess. And
my good friend Ernie Burgess.
Shout out to Ernie if you're watching. He's got a quote from Bill Lawton. He says, Bill Lawton used to say, preach Christmas at Easter and Easter at Christmas. Do you follow this pattern?
If you're going to preach Christmas at Easter, you'd be what? Telling people that Jesus came? And if you're going to preach Easter at Christmas, you'd be telling people that he rose. Is that is Bill's idea that you rattle the cage?
I guess that's
that would be a very Bill
thing to do.
Principle, rattle the cage.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I can't think of why you do it.
Tell me then about the emotions of Christmas, the emotions of Easter. Like, are you wanting to create a sense of what emotional feel are you looking for on Good Friday morning, if any, and what emotional feel are you looking for on Easter Sunday, if any?
I feel quite strongly about this because I think it is very hard to say to our regulars especially that you should be very emotional about the cross and the resurrection. They are such familiar topics. What we need is a greater appreciation which may then bring emotion. But there's no point in sort of squeezing the emotional tear ducts unless there is some new information to persuade the emotion. So I think it's very unfair to pretend that regulars or even visitors are going to suddenly get excited. The tomb was empty. You know?
Yeah, because I've known it for a few years.
I've known it for decades, yeah. What we should be saying is, what's the significance of this? Another good illustration that I've always liked is Lloyd Jones, who said once in a sermon, I've never forgotten this, he said, God did creation with a word, but he said, if I may put this reverently, God cannot forgive you with a word. So he can make the universe by speaking, but he cannot forgive you by speaking. His son had to come down from heaven, die on the cross, pay for your sin, in order that he might be able to speak the word. Now that's a very powerful concept, because a lot of people think, why doesn't God just forgive me? Why doesn't he just say it? And if I meet him, he's such a nice person, he will. But it's the logic of the cross, it's the new information which then can create, if possible, emotion, but it's a secondary.
Great. Simon, thanks so much for coming in this afternoon.
It's a pleasure.
Simon Manchester has been my guest on The Pastor's Heart. Now, just to let you know where we're going, next week we'll have Dan Wu with us. He's a lecturer at Moore Theological College. I want to speak to him about the whole topic of shame and guilt, because in the various discussions I've been in over the last 6 months, from 3 different angles I've been hearing about this topic and different theses on this topic, but it just seems to be a thing that people are talking about, and Dan has actually done quite a lot of research into that area, and so I'm looking forward to hearing from him on that subject. We're going to get, over the next couple of weeks, a couple of the other guests coming in, we're going to be talking to Sam Chan. He's an evangelist with the City Bible Forum, and he's just put out a book. It's not even been released yet, but it's called Evangelism in a Skeptical World, and I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on a copy of that in the next few days. I'm told it's going to arrive in the post in the next few days, and then getting Sam in to talk to him about that and find out what can we learn together to do evangelism better in this current day and age. And then Rachel Ciano is going to join us as well. She's a lecturer at Sydney Missionary and Bible College in Church History. She's giving a presentation on, is the Pope really Catholic? And I just thought we'd dig down into that subject with Rachel in a couple of weeks' time. And so there are a couple of our guests coming up on The Pastor's Heart. Now, just a reminder, you can ask a question for each of these discussions on the video on our Facebook page. It's The Pastor's Heart on Facebook, but then all of our talks end up on an archive at thepastorsheart.net, and you can subscribe to the audio either via iTunes or the RSS feed. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll look forward to seeing you 2 o'clock next week or on the podcast. Cheers.